and welcome to the 5th episode of our podcast, Espresso with the Experts. Today, we have the honor to have our Espresso with a professor from the Economic Department, Professor Suresh Naidu, and Katy Habr, that is an organizer for the student workers of Columbia. So, thank you for being here, both of you. We are going to have coffee today to discuss what's going on with labor unions in the US. Professor Suresh Naidu will provide us with a general context and research findings on the topic, while Katy Habr will share her experience in different unions. So, let's start with a brief introduction of the speakers. Professor Suresh Naidu is a Jack Wang and Iko Ren Professor of Economics and of the International and Public Affairs at Columbia University. Before that, he was an Harvard Academy Fellow from 2008 until 2010. He works on labor union organizing and other topics in political economy, such as the economic effects of democracy and non-democracy, and monopsony in labor markets. Katy Habr, she's a student and Paul Lazarsfeld Fellow in the Sociology Department at Columbia University, and she's a fellow on the Insight Labor Lab and part of the Worker Empowerment Research Network. Last but not least, as we were saying, Katy Habr is an organizer of the Student Workers of Columbia. Before joining Columbia University, Katy Habr was also a researcher for the United Steelworkers Union in Pittsburgh. So, Katy Habr research as well covers labor unions. She's also working on the gig economy, underemployment, labor organizing more in general, and political education. Let's start with our question. The unionization rate has been increasing. It is happening in historically unionized sectors, for example, the automotive, in which new companies are unionizing. We have the examples of Tesla and Toyota. Also, in other sectors, unionizing is happening. An example is the restoration with Starbucks, but even basketball players at Dartmouth College are unionizing. So, I would like to know from you, Professor Suresh Naidu, what are the main sectors unionizing and what are the most important unionization cases?
Okay, I want to start off responding to this by sort of making a distinction between sort of union membership and union coverage. So, for example, you can be a member of a labor union, and in the U.S., that pretty much means that you're covered by a labor union contract, you're covered by a collective bargaining agreement. But in many countries around the world, there's a big difference between being a labor union member and being covered by a contract. And even in the U.S., this difference exists, but it's been very small. So, but for example, France, something like 70-80% of the workers are covered by a collective bargaining agreement, but the union density is like 9-10%. And so you can have countries where the difference between being where your wages and benefits are set by a union is very different from like, are you a member of the labor union? And it just happens to be that the U.S., those two things happen to be go very tightly together because of the nature of the U.S. Structure of collective bargaining, where you kind of organize a particular company, you vote for, when you get a representation election, you vote for the coverage of your company, and then pretty much like the union is empowered to negotiate on the behalf of the people in that company, and winds up generally negotiating on behalf, getting everyone to sign cards as kind of and join the union and pay dues, almost as a condition of being the official representative of those workers. So that's kind of how it works in the U.S. and why those two things are very tightly linked. But it's also interesting that when you actually look at the share of the private sector workers covered by a union, that actually went up last year. So I have a little bit different numbers. I looked at this up in the CPS yesterday looking at 2023. But it's like the overall union density rate stayed constant at 10%. And in fact, membership stayed constant in the private sector, but coverage increased a little bit in the private sector, but then it decreased a little bit in the public sector. And those two things have sort of been pushed a little bit in opposite directions. And it's also, there's like a big difference between the sectors that, we just have to take account of like the U.S. is 160 million workers. So to move like a percentage point in density is an enormous number of people joining unions. So we can't really expect like on a 1-year basis to see like a movement in these overall union density numbers unless something really major changes. And so I think like the directions we've been seeing, it's like, oh well, it's for once it's not falling. It's like, it's already kind of evidence that there's something happening. And when you look at the data, what you have to realize is that, well, what gets the media is kind of the new organizing and getting like and new sectors organizing and really big companies kind of either recognizing unions or being involved with unions. But the overall big dynamical force driving union density in the U.S. is like overwhelmingly exit of already unionized companies. And so the very fact that you're able to hold density constant as like unionized companies go out of business, and that just happens, recurringly, that's suggesting that you're kind of generating enough new organizing to push back against just this trend of decay. And so that's interesting and exciting. And the sectors where you see that are maybe not the ones that necessarily get the most press. So it's like education and healthcare sort of seeing like a small increase. Accommodation has seen a small increase. You haven't really seen anything in retail and overall, and so and manufacturing has seen a little bit of an increase, not that much. So that's I think like a good way to sort of say like, well, yes, we can look at the media and you can see lots of coverage of unions, but when you just have to take it in the context of like the giant American labor market, and then the sectors where you actually see the movement here are potentially different from the ones that get a lot of press coverage.
Okay, thank you. So, Katy Habr, as Professor Suresh Naidu was saying, actually, one of the sectors unionizing is education. We would like to know more about what is a university union. So, how different is a university union with respect to all the other company unions, let's say, in other sectors?
Great, thank you. So I can start off by talking a little bit about Student Workers of Columbia, SWC. So this is basically a union that represents student workers that perform instructional and research activities at the university. So, for example, PhD students like me teach classes or are teaching assistants or work as research assistants, but also a lot of master's and undergrad students do that too. It also, covers people who work in labs, things like that. Anyone who produces research or does teaching. And I would say that student unions are just like any other unions. They exist for workers coming together and, asking for better wages, better workplace protections, more say over their working conditions. We had to fight very hard at SWC to be recognized as workers. And that was a national case, whether or not, graduate students were workers. And we ended up winning because we do crucial labor for the university, such as teaching a lot of classes and, doing a lot of the hard work of the research. So I think there's a long history of unions on campus. So like clerical workers, other support staff have long been unionized, and, other like janitorial, maintenance, dining hall staff. And so I think, unionizing student workers is also kind of the next step in this. And there's also other types of student unions. For example, I know at Columbia and Barnard, the residence advisors have also unionized because they have to deal, with a lot of difficult things in their working conditions. So I think this is kind of a broader trend of the increase in unionization across the university, which I think is a really great thing. In terms of SWC, we're structured as a generally non-hierarchical organization, and we work through different committees. So, for example, when we were bargaining, there was a bargaining committee, an organizing committee. Now we have, a grievance committee, an education committee, communications committee, things like that. And so what we really try to do is have a rank and file led union where it's the membership making the decisions. And that's really, I think, what gives us our power. So we don't really have staff, and we have different, committees, working groups that kind of run everything and make all the decisions and file all our grievances and things like that. I think we also see our role as not just fighting for everyday working conditions, but also connecting the things that we deal with as student workers with broader struggles. For example, a lot of people, grad students, are not paid a living wage. It's very expensive to live in New York. A lot of people have families, things like that. Children can't afford to live on those wages. Before the contract, we didn't have vision or health insurance, dental insurance, things like that. People didn't have protection from harassment and discrimination in their labs or, from their supervisors, things like that. But also relating that to wider issues like keeping, our community safe from, police or ICE, things like that. Those campaigns have happened. And, trying to also control what purposes our research is going for and generally try to turn back this stem of increasing precarity.
Thank you, Katy Habr. As we said, union density is actually kind of low. It came up before as well. And it used to be different because actually in the 50s, union membership was very high. And 1/3 almost of the workforce was covered by unions. So it was all a different story. The history of labor unions actually can be kind of dated back to 1935 with the National Labor Relations Act that was passed into law. This act allowed workers to organize and recognized legally unions. So the 50s was actually then the peak of the labor unions. But after that, generally in the US, but not only in the US, we can say unionization rate has been decreasing. In general, a problem, as Katy Habr brought up, for workers is that of being recognized as employees as well in order to actually set up a labor union. So what are the, if you can discuss through some of these points and what are the ways the labor unions are trying to solve these problems?
Yeah, so a couple of things. I think we should, it's just clearly the case that the economy and structurally it's just things are different from the 1930s and 40s. And, and it's true that we had 1/3 of the workforce in labor unions in the 1950s. It's also true that the composition of that workforce was very different. It's also, the people that were in labor unions in the 1950s were, for example, much less educated than the average American. And of course, it was overwhelmingly male. And but now you look today, and actually, union members are depending on whether or not you include the public sector, you can actually get they're relatively more educated than the average American. And the gender mix is roughly, not quite, but it's close to 50-50 in the unionized sector. So I think it's the composition of who's in unions has changed along with density. And it looks different in different countries. So even Canada, that has very similar institutions to the U.S., has managed to keep union density about double of what it is in the U.S. So there are some common trends, and then there is this kind of institutional variation. I think some of that institutional variation just comes from this weird structure that a lot of countries, the Anglo countries, have of organizing on a firm by firm basis, where you kind of and there was a real, I think, good idea there, which is that the natural units of solidarity are sort of formed on the workplace level, and so that should be the level at which collective bargaining and union recognition happens. Was that okay? We're going to take that kind of organic solidarity that happens at work and sort of build a collective bargaining structure out of that. And I think there's some good ideas there, but that's clearly not enough to sort of maintain a high level of union density in the face of the kind of natural churn of businesses going in and out of work, unless you're willing to spend just an enormous amount of money organizing new plants. and new workforces and new sectors and all of the, just as the economy transforms, you kind of need to be spending a huge amount of time and energy trying to incorporate these new businesses into the unionized sector. And that's just kind of like you're on a hamster wheel that you cannot win in that. And so that's what sort of pushed, in terms of some of the innovations, that's kind of why this distinction between coverage and membership has become more important. So, for example, like sectoral bargaining has become a proposal which exists in lots of European countries where you have the union will negotiate a contract among a few of the very large companies, but then that contract is kind of automatically extended to cover all the workers in that sector or in that municipality. And so basically lots of workers wind up getting covered by a union contract that's still like negotiated by a union, and that union membership can be high or low, but you still sort of get this union coverage. I think there's like pluses and minuses to that. Like you wind up with unions that are possibly not actually representative of all the workers that are like covered by it. And you can kind of see this sometimes in like Portugal has complete coverage of everyone, but some of the unions are incredibly indolent, and so you get these sectoral bargaining agreements that have not been updated in decades. And then you have countries like in Scandinavia, which is it's almost unfair to talk about Scandinavia in this context. But one of the ways they both have sectoral agreements, but because the unions also have a way in which you get access to unemployment insurance by being a union member, they've been able to keep both membership and coverage up because there's this real strong incentive to join the union as part of to get unemployment insurance. And so that's kind of like another way in which like I think unions are trying to figure out how do we give advantages to being a member so that we can keep membership up even as we try to like get coverage of even non-members informed. So like Minnesota, I'll just give an example from the US, like Minnesota just is about to institutionalize like a sectoral bargaining agreement covering nursing home workers, and I'm kind of like in the middle of a big project studying that. And so, yeah.
Okay, thank you. That's super interesting. And with Katy Habr, now we would like to discuss a little bit how is labor union strike. In 2021-2022, at Columbia University, there was a strike to negotiate the first graduate student labor contract at Columbia. So as you, Katy Habr, took part in the strike as organizer of the student union, I would like to hear from you a little bit the dynamic of the strike. What were the objectives that actually the strike managed to reach? What was the hardest to bargain on with the university?
Yeah, I think that, SWC has been, I think, gone on strike every year since, 2014, 15, something like that, throughout the organizing campaign to get recognized, to get an election, to start bargaining, all these things. So we're kind of used to going on strike. But I think what happened this time that was really different was before, so there was, the big strike that happened from like October 2021 and it ended in January 2022. And basically right before that, we had a huge upheaval in the union. So we had a short strike before that was kind of, I would say, failed. And that, was kind of run by a bargaining committee that, maybe wasn't the strongest or the most accountable. And so what we really did was restructured the whole union. So we elected a new slate on the bargaining committee that was, rank and file led. And we had new bylaws that all bargaining committee meetings had to be open and that no decisions were going to be made at the table without being voted on by membership before. And I think that's really kind of what gave us the power to go on strike and to last for so long. So I think that, the membership was very active. And we also had open bargaining, which was a really big deal because people would come online and, see how the university lawyers were talking about, the graduate students who can't afford to live as not producing value, things like that. And you would have 200, 300 people on the bargaining call, and people hearing that, just got them really fired up. And then also knowing that their voice was heard, that they were part of this, voting on every proposal before it was passed. So like nothing would be presented at the table before the membership agreed on it. We also had votes every week, whether or not we wanted to continue striking another week. And so that way we knew that if we were still striking, we were going strong, and it was with the mandate of the membership. And we could go back to the table and say, look, even if we wanted to accept your proposal, we can't because the membership is not going to vote on this and agree to it. So I think that was really powerful and what gave us like a really strong position at the table was just having that rank and file involvement. And, there was a lot of different committees drafting contract language and also organizing different actions. We had great turnout from other unions around the city, and especially when Columbia threatened to replace instructors and things like that. We had a pledge from other instructors from around the city that they would not replace our labor. So it was definitely really hard and stressful. People were being paid and didn't know what was going to happen, if they were going to lose their jobs. It was definitely a scary time, but I think the way that we really stuck together and, developed this hardship fund where we would fundraise and, distribute money to people on strike, that really helped people keep going. And so I think personally it was also a very fulfilling experience to build community with people across different departments and just being on campus all day, being a picket captain, staying up late at night during like the bargaining sessions or trying to plan things. It was just really fulfilling to feel that, we were coming together collectively to say that we, need these things. We need enough money to live. We need to have childcare for our children. We need to have dental insurance, things like that. And, all the things that we thought we weren't going to be able to win, we eventually were able to, just because we had the power of knowing that all of the membership was on board and everything was done, with everyone's power and consideration. So, yeah.
Okay. That's very interesting as well. Thank you so much, Katy Habr. And strike at Columbia had probably a role also on other universities, right? Like they do impact each other in a way.
I mean, Princeton almost just like raised wages for its graduate students almost like immediately in response to the Columbia contract. So it's just kind of, I think it and then I think Columbia really like set the tone for lots of the other universities. And, this original case at the NLRB came up through Columbia. And so it's, and it was interesting. I actually think, Katy, it would be great to hear what you think about, like, so for example, Yale had been trying to unionize graduate students since the 90s and it never was able to get off the ground. And then in the space of like 5 years, every like major research university in the as just like in the public sector had been organized a while ago, but they all went in the space of a short period of time. I'd be curious what you think is kind of getting nothing for decades, it then tips very quickly.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it's like a domino effect. You see one happen, and then, we also all work together. I mean, I've talked to people at I don't know how many campuses trying to figure out how to plan a campaign and how to win and how to organize. And I think those networks are really valuable, and, the solidarity that's been built across campuses. And we're all facing the same bad job market. We're all facing low wages. We're all facing the same thing. And so it kind of makes sense that, a rising tide lifts all boats, that we all, have a lot to gain from helping each other out. So
Definitely. And with respect to this, I have a specific question for Professor Suresh Naidu. That is there a future for a U.S. labor movement? I guess you recognize the sentence. It's a paper of yours.
I actually think one of the big things is just the tight labor market. And when you have an unemployment rate of 3.5%, 4%, if you think that the worst thing that an employer can do to bust a campaign is fire all the organizers, that becomes a lot harder when the labor market's super tight. They still do it, absolutely, but it's like they think twice about it when the labor market's tight. So my actual one of my big worries is that the next recession, it just deflates all of this. It deflates all of this. But that said, I think that's at the national level. I think we're going to get sectoral bargaining in the big blue states, like piecemeal by piecemeal. But like so, New York, Massachusetts, Minnesota, California, Washington, particularly in states that have a big in sectors that have a big public footprint, like education, healthcare, construction, infrastructure, all that stuff, where they're basically going to stay. They're either going to get sectoral bargaining or they're going to stay unionized. So I think the blue states will sort of continue to be union fortresses, but I think without something at the federal level, the red states will continue to be low wage kind of non-union environments.
Okay, thank you. And so I would like to hear some more also about Katy Habr research. Also investigating changes in union organizing and employers' anti-union tactics. So given your role as a PhD student and your research on the matter, how do you apply it to your everyday work, let's say, in a union?
So I think a lot of the things that I research are also problems that we are facing in the union because they are problems that a lot of industries are facing. And I think, the main thing is kind of this idea of increased precarity and the degradation of work. And so if you look at the gig economy, you can kind of see that where, workers are being pushed into being classified as contractors. So they, don't have the protections of labor law, of minimum wage, other types of protection, can't join a union, things like that. And, you see more and more jobs being kind of become more insecure, more unstable, more flexible, low wage, things like that. And I think that's not just something that we see in the low wage sector. I think we see that across a lot of industries. I mean, we see media, huge layoffs, a lot of newsrooms closing down. We also see in academia, the decline of tenure track positions, the rise of adjuncts, and just basically I think most of academia, especially new hires, are in these precarious positions. And so I think that as grad students, that is something that we have to deal with. That is an issue that we face as we go on the market, but also, because our labor is used as part of this kind of, cheap labor that runs the university. And even within the union, there's always, efforts to cut positions out of the union, which we had, a big protracted fight about when we were bargaining. So I think those lessons, I do take them and they do apply. I think the other things that are interesting is studying anti-union behavior by employers, which also Suresh is also on the project. But just being on strike and in a bargaining campaign or another type of union campaign, and just kind of seeing the things that you are learning about being, happening to you. It's just interesting to be able to recognize them and say oh yeah, this is a classic, employer tactic. And so I think that it's useful for me definitely to have both the kind of research understanding and, the day-to-day practice of it. And that's why I think it's important to do public-facing research so that, unions can have this information and people can know these things while they're organizing, and that just strengthens them.
Okay, definitely. So we would like to close with a final question. It's more of a personal question, actually, in this case. And as said, you are both scholars and, let's say, professionals, so members of labor union, and you both work on labor unions, but you're both at the end academics, let's say. So I'm curious to know, if you didn't become academics, what would have it been? Who would you be today? So what was the moment that you decided to become an academic? Who wants to start?
I mean, it's funny. I actually went to graduate school in economics with the idea that I was going to go back and Canadian, so I was going to I was going to be an economist working for the Canadian Auto Workers, because that was what I wanted to do, and that was my horizon for econ grad school. And but then the graduate student process, like the whole prestige network and socialization, is just that you wind up thinking that like the doing research is like kind of the coolest, most valuable thing. And so then somewhere, and but you're also beset with various crises in graduate school, and so there's many times I would go to like my advisor and be like, I'm just going to drop out and like go be and go work for the union, and I got talked out of it a couple of times, and so I think it was like but it was also like I think you couldn't really study unions in economics very much because there was no unions in the U.S. And so, but I'm an economic historian, and so a lot of my work on unions was kind of doing it over the 20th century when it was like. But then, having done that, it wound up being relevant again to the extent that unions are relevant again. So I think I had a few sliding door moments. I did just want to like offer this as also reflecting on what Katy said. It was just that here's my worry is that, and it's related to this, is that the future for the labor movement winds up being like unions are yet another thing that's like a thing of the highly educated. And that just like the Democratic Party and center-left parties have become the party of the college-educated, that the other institutions that sort of were part of that, like social democracy coalition, also become captured by like the relatively educated. That's not to say rich, but it is to say often even coming from families with education or something like that. And so that being an academic, that the growth in the labor movement is in graduate students and in education, that I worry that without this like federal thing and without this kind of other energy, that it winds up being that it's exactly the only people that are in labor unions are academics, and yeah.
Will you contribute more to your role in the labor union as an academic? What was your sliding door, Katy Habr, and what are you gonna do with labor unions?
I mean, I feel like I probably had a pretty similar trajectory to Suresh, where I, worked for a union before and then wanted to look at these, kind of same questions in a bigger way. And so I've always been interested in doing labor research and have, did that in undergrad and continue to do that now. And I don't know that I had, a particular moment. It was just kind of like a path that I fell into, and it's what makes sense for me. And I think, being part of the labor movement in one way or another is kind of the only thing the only thing that really makes sense for me, whether it's being an academic and working with, unions or just working for a union. And I will say to Suresh's point that I do agree. And I think, something that makes me feel optimistic is that even though a lot of, new growth is happening kind of in higher ed and things like that, there are kind of these huge, reform movements in unions to make them stronger and more militant. And a lot of that is happening, in auto, in like the Teamsters, and like kind of in these like blue collar jobs that I think sometimes can get forgotten. And so I think that, when we realize that we all are kind of fighting the same forces, I think it just makes the labor movement stronger as a whole. So,
thank you, Katy Habr. So this was a great conversation. I want to thank again our speakers, and I want to invite you, our listeners, to follow us. You can find the episode on Spotify and on Apple Podcast, and you can also follow us on Instagram. I'm looking forward to many more exciting conversations with the Columbia community. See you in the next episode.